Welcome to Quebec Zulu Juliett, a podcast primarily about radio communication in crisis and war, especially portable land mobile radio communication in outdoor environments. You could say that Quebec Zulu Juliett, or QZJ, is a C4 ISR podcast, covering command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. I've touched on all of these areas in previous Swedish episodes, and also on the YouTube channel Utesändaren or The Outsender. Link is in the description. I'm not referring to C4 ISR systems specifically, but rather the activities that define modern command and control, typically supported by various C2 systems. These days, we also hear about C5 ISR and even C6 ISR, which add cyber defense and combat systems into the mix. I work as a senior IT consultant with a background in security, so I'm well versed in cyber defense, but that hasn't been the major focus of this podcast. I've also worked in the defense industry, specifically with naval combat management systems, so I could include that as well. But I'll stick with calling this a C4 ISR podcast, as I see C6 ISR more as an extension, one that brings in cyber capabilities and integrated combat systems in a decentralized way, often linked to naval platforms due to their complexity and networking demands, though of course not limited to sea vessels per se, so to say. And as you have noticed, from now on, the Quebec Zulu Juliett podcast will be in English. I could blame my wife, who has encouraged me for years to create content in English rather than Swedish, but the real reason is that I haven't received enough feedback or discussion from the Swedish-speaking audience. Having been criticized in the past for making English content by some Swedish listeners, I have to say it feels like I'm too close to home for perhaps meaningful engagement. Sweden is now part of NATO, and few people speak Swedish there. But also, to be blunt, my terrain tactical communication concept that I call the Zenith Concept, designed specifically to counter Russian electronic warfare, received zero interest from the Swedish Armed Forces. Ironically, I was offered a position by Ukrainian signal officers at the very start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I didn't pursue that, partly because I had small children at the time, and partly because my wife forbade me from going to Ukraine as early as December 2021, 2 months before the invasion. My critique of the Swedish defense procurement system has likewise generated no real interest in Sweden, even now, with a defense budget aiming for 5% of GDP. You'd think efficient use of that budget would be a priority, especially considering today's rapid OODA loops, observe, orient, decide, and act loops in defense tech. But no, all quiet on that front. These are just a few of the reasons I've decided to expand the scope of this podcast, and I welcome input from all fellow NATO members, especially those in the Baltic region, from the countries surrounding quote-unquote Lake NATO, and of course the UK and our transatlantic allies. I suffer from some kind of Cassandra syndrome, maybe foreseeing the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in December 2021 was not very impressive, but predicting that Trump would win the 2024 election back in 2022 and writing about it received some seriously weird reactions. I did not really expect to be called a Nazi, a fascist, or other derogative labels just for making this prediction. But apparently there's a reason why the term "don't shoot the messenger" is so well known. This Cassandra-like syndrome has definitely made its mark on me throughout the years, but I really try not to sound too negative or perhaps arrogant, despite repeatedly having been bashed just for having some foresight, even as I stopped saying "I told you so" many years ago. Nobody likes the know-it-all, obviously. I do like to think critically, though, and that is apparently sometimes misinterpreted as excessively criticizing everything. As perhaps a quote-unquote natural solution architect, I love to dig deep into problems to understand them well before engineering a solution. And this will definitely shine through in the content of this podcast. Recently, I started another podcast in Swedish called Everything as Code, which is a play on infrastructure as code, a familiar concept in the DevOps world within IT. It's the idea that IT infrastructure can be defined in code or structured language, which is then executed by build environments to configure IT services. Everything as code argues that this mindset is spreading beyond IT, especially in defense, where systems are increasingly software-driven, rendering traditional procurement models obsolete. Using a couple of AI services, I created an audiobook-style essay about the Swedish defense procurement system, which I will republish as the next episode of Quebec Zulu Juliett, since it's in English. Sweden's system, like the US Department of Defense procurement system, is still heavily based on the old waterfall and V-model approach. Going a bit off topic here, I'm currently listening on the recent episode of the Cogs of War podcast, which is my top podcast recommendation for anyone interested in the acquisition and procurement side of defense tech, especially modern agile ways of doing things. You can see the description for a link to this podcast. It's highly recommended. As for Everything as Code, I plan to discontinue it as a separate podcast and fold it into Quebec Zulu Juliett, since it fits neatly under the computers component of C4ISR. Managing two podcasts isn't feasible at the moment, and this integration will help keep the focus tight while still broadening the content of this podcast. So let me give you a few examples of past episodes I've done in Swedish that I intend to revisit in English in coming episodes. One of the first episodes was about my experience in a supporting IT role in a forward operating base handling a big forest fire we had in Sweden in 2014, covering IT as well as emergency cell phone and microwave link networking issues. Another was about complex systems. One was about Swedish Armed Forces acronyms useful for reporting and reconnaissance operations. I had an episode introducing the listener to Morse code and mistakes I've made trying to learn CW, as it's called in ham radio circles, or radio circles in general. Another episode was about non-cooperative target recognition as a way of thinking about compromising emissions, which is obviously important in a electromagnetically contested environment. One episode was about the Agile framework called Scrum, regarding the military leadership philosophy of mission command, or mission-style tactics, I think it's called in Britain. One was about my side project, Arke, trying to tie together the ideas of Hans von Dach from his book Der totale Widerstand, or Total Resistance, which it's called in English, and research from RAND, envisioning a civilian radio operator training initiative for a resistance movement type of scenario. Another episode was about planning with the recognitional planning model, RPM, based on the recognition prime decision model by Gary Klein and John F. Schmidt. There was an episode about the Zenith Concept I mentioned earlier, which is about HF communications in an electromagnetically contested environment. I made a review episode of the book War Diaries, a radio amateur in Kiev by Uniform Sierra 7 India Golf November Volodymyr. Another episode was about the after-action review, followed by a couple of episodes about the myths of EMP and hemp, HEMP, regarding their effect on radio communication equipment and electronics in general, backed with a lot of research. This was contrasted by my 5 points of survival aid the memoir, primarily focused on preparing to go out into the wilderness regarding priorities, skills, and equipment. Next episode was about the GPS QRM or GNSS QRM, that is man-made interference we are experiencing around the Baltics and other areas. These are the kinds of topics you can expect in future episodes. As I mentioned, the next episode will be the audiobook-style essay on the Swedish defense procurement system and how it aligns or conflicts with the doctrine of mission command, which is the official doctrine of the Swedish Armed Forces. It does advocate for my outcome-based Agile framework, the OBAF, but that's because it draws directly from the original Agile manifesto. So if nothing else, you can view the analysis as a comparison of procurement philosophies through the lens of Agile thinking, essentially. I don't have a follow-up episode ready just yet, but I do have an idea in the works. It revolves around a new prediction that ties together 3 emerging developments. Trump's tariffs on the EU and specifically the automotive industry, a significant wave of IT consultant layoffs in the automotive sector, and the accelerating scale-up of AI automation in IT-related roles. All 3 are likely to converge in a way that could have a major impact on the city of Gothenburg in Sweden, starting this autumn and continuing during 2026, obviously. Or at least, at the very least, it will have an effect on the IT sector here. I live in Gothenburg in Sweden, so I will be directly affected, if nothing else. So that will be an interesting experience going forward. If you like to get in touch with me, you find contact information on qzj.se. I spell Quebec Zulu Juliett Sierra Echo, qzj.se. And you find also this contact information in the description of this episode. My name is Mike, and my amateur radio call sign is Sierra Alpha 6 Mike Whiskey Alpha. Until the next episode, this is Mike, out.